Your scars and hematomas will disappear in a couple of weeks. After several months of physical conditioning, the process will be complete.
Welcome to episode 20 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of aging and identity, with two movies that take the viewer on a disorientating journey into the price of reinvention and rejuvenation. First up, we have Seconds from 1966 and director John Frankenheimer, featuring a career-best performance from former matinee idol Rock Hudson, alongside Salome and Geer. Then we bring ourselves bang up to date, almost, with The Substance from 2024 and director Coralie Fargeat, featuring a career-best performance from Demi Moore, alongside Margaret Qualley and Quaid. As well as their shared Faustian central bargains and the startling performances from their two leads, both films also share experimental and disorientating cinematography, depicting mysterious organizations, cosmetic surgery, self-destructive behavior, and no small amount of paranoia. Both films explicitly remind the audience that no matter what you do, you can never really escape yourself, but they also hold up a magnifying mirror to the societies that caused their characters despair in the first place. Before we dive into this week's episode though, I'd just like to let everyone know that the show will be taking the briefest of pauses next week, as I give myself a weekend off. But I guarantee you we will be back on Sunday the 12th of October, and I'll let you know what films we'll be discussing at the end of this episode. And that being said, as always, I'd like to mention the main references that I've used for this week's episode, all of which will be listed in the show notes. So when discussing Seconds, I have referenced the book Seconds by Jez Connolly and Emma Westwood, the director's commentary on the Masters of Cinema Blu-ray release, an article on the making of the film from the American Society of Cinematographers website, the ASC.com, American Film Institute, IMDb and Wikipedia entries on the film, John Frankenheimer and Rock Hudson, and a video titled The Making of Seconds that can be found on YouTube. And when discussing The Substance, I have referred to interviews with Coralie Fargeat, Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley on ScreenDaily.com, IndieWire.com, The Hollywood Reporter, HammerToNail.com and W Magazine. I've also referred to the making of featurette and a Q&A between Coralie Fargeat and Guillermo del Toro, both of which were produced by Mubi and can currently be found on YouTube. And we're actually going to be covering quite a bit of ground in this week's episode, so without any further ado, I'm just going to jump straight into the first of this week's films. Seconds was directed by John Frankenheimer and released in 1966. It stars Rock Hudson, Salome Geer and John Randolph, and is based on a novel of the same name by David Ely. And we are going to be getting into the spoilers very early this week, so if you haven't seen Seconds yet, I highly suggest that you press pause and come back once you have. Being completely transparent, I have never read the novel upon which this film is based, nor have I read any of David Ely's other works, and there actually isn't a huge amount of information about the author online. I'm not even completely sure that that is how one pronounces his name. He seems to have been a largely private person and gave no interviews, or at least none that survive today. So what little I know about him has been gleaned from a rather short publisher's biography and summaries of his body of work, which appears to lean heavily into the dark and the cynical. So what I can tell you is that he was born in 1927 in Chicago, Illinois, and that he studied first at the University of North Carolina before completing his degree at Harvard in 1949. Following this, he served both in the US Navy and the US Army, and then worked as a journalist. By the early 1960s, he had begun to publish short stories and novels, many of which seem preoccupied with themes of identity, control, and the price of freedom. In 1960, he published his debut novel Trot, a suspense story in which an army investigator becomes entangled in a case that blurs loyalty and personal survival when he is called upon to arrest a friend, and which has been described as foreshadowing the world of most of his fiction, a world that is mysterious and hostile. The same year, he published a short story called The Academy, which tells of a father enrolling his son in a rather too-good-to-be-true military academy, and which would go on to be adapted for the Rod Serling series Night Gallery in 1971. He followed this with the publication of Seconds in 1962, which portrayed another mysterious and oppressive organisation, and which we will, of course, be talking about shortly. A year later, he won an Edgar Allan Poe Award from the Mystery Writers of America for his short story The Sailing Club, which tells of disillusioned businessmen seeking excitement in their lives by joining the mysterious club of the title. He followed this in 1967 with the publication of his novel The Tour, a dystopian psychological thriller in which wealthy tourists embark on a hallucinogenic tour of a Central American republic, expecting excitement and diversion, but actually finding a manufactured theatre of guerrilla uprisings, military spectacle, and weapons testing. As we can see, this novel concerns another mysterious and oppressive organisation, and also explores themes of identity, privacy, and the blurring of the lines between fantasy and reality. And this exploration would continue in 1970 with the publication of Poor Devils, which follows a history professor drawn into an ambitious and possibly genocidal government project called Project Nomad, which is supposedly going to eradicate poverty. More paranoid still is his 1974 follow-up, Mr. Nicholas, which is about an executive in the surveillance industry who begins to believe that he himself is under observation everywhere and all the time. His final major work, A Journal of the Flood Year, was published in 1992, and is presented as the diary of a bureaucrat in a flooded and authoritarian America. As you can tell from this brief description of just some of his works, taken together, his novels and stories would appear to be rather consistent in tone and theme, with central characters confronting mysterious and oppressive organizations, or discovering that the promises of freedom and liberation offered by others are in fact just another form of manipulation and control. Seconds tells the story of Arthur Hamilton, a middle-aged banker who has become disillusioned with his comfortable but empty suburban life. His daughter is married and raising a family of her own, and his relationship with his wife is distant and loveless, though to be fair, this seems to be more on his side than on hers. And then one night, a phone call from a friend that he believed to be dead offers him the chance of a do-over, a complete transformation by a mysterious company that specializes in giving clients a second life. Through an elaborate process of fake death, surgery, exercise, and reinvention, he is reborn as a younger presenting man with a new identity and career as an artist, seemingly free to start over and live a more bohemian life. But as he tries to settle into this new existence, he finds that escaping his past and escaping himself is far more complicated than he imagined. In 1964, it was announced that the film rights to the novel had been acquired by the actor Kirk Douglas for $75,000, which today would be just shy of $800,000. Douglas had just released the highly successful political thriller 7 Days in May, a film that would go on to be nominated for 2 Academy Awards and several Golden Globes, which had also starred Burt Lancaster, Frederick March, and Ava Gardner. It had been directed by John Frankenheimer and produced by Edward Lewis, and Douglas was keen to repeat the relationship and also, hopefully, the success. The plan was for Seconds to be the inaugural project for the newly formed Douglas and Lewis Productions, and became part of a 2-picture deal established with Paramount Studios. Born in 1930 in Queens, New York City, John Frankenheimer served in the US Air Force, where he worked in a unit dedicated to motion pictures and photography. This experience gave him hands-on training in lighting, editing, and camera operation, and so on leaving the military, it was quite natural that he would move into television. This was the 1950s, a time when the medium was still developing, and when dramas would be televised live. Beginning with CBS, he worked as an assistant to Sidney Lumet, before directing live TV dramas for shows like Climax and Playhouse 90. This period was known as the Golden Age of television, and was really where he developed his skills and also established his reputation as a director of incredibly tightly staged productions. It has been said that he would quite happily have remained directing live TV performances for the rest of his life, but before long the medium had moved on, and so had Frankenheimer. His transition to feature films began with The Young Stranger in 1957, a low-budget drama about juvenile delinquency, which he followed with The Young Savages in 1961, another delinquency story but with a larger budget and a starrier cast, including Burt Lancaster and the debut movie appearance by Telly Savalas. While the film itself received very mixed reviews, with some calling it a non-musical version of West Side Story, Variety at least said that it was, quote, inventingly and arrestingly directed by John Frankenheimer, end quote. A year later, he directed The Birdman of Alcatraz, which again starred Burt Lancaster and Telly Savalas, and this told a largely fictionalized version of the story of Robert Stroud. Stroud was a federal prison inmate who became known as the Birdman of Alcatraz because of his studies of birds whilst incarcerated, and who was sentenced to solitary confinement after killing a prison guard. Based on a 1955 novel of the same name, it was nominated for several Academy Awards, including Best Actor in a Leading Role for Burt Lancaster, Best Actor in a Supporting Role for Telly Savalas, Best Actress in a Supporting Role for Thelma Ritter, and Best Cinematography, Black and White category. That same year, he released The Manchurian Candidate, a Cold War political thriller that has since become his most iconic work, starring Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey, Janet Leigh, and a quite remarkable performance from Angela Lansbury. The film tells the story of American soldiers captured during the Korean War who were brainwashed into becoming communist sleeper agents. Released at the height of US and Soviet tensions and the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is a film about paranoia, conspiracy, and corruption, and was a critical success, as well as earning an Oscar nomination for Angela Lansbury, as well as a nomination for Best Editing. I've already mentioned 1964's 7 Days in May, and in the same year he also released The Train, which was a taut wartime thriller, again starring Burt Lancaster, as well as a more international cast of Jean Moreau, Paul Schofield, and Howard Vernon from Alphaville and The Awful Dr. Orloff. Like its predecessor, the film earned itself an Oscar nod, this time for Best Story and Screenplay written directly for the screen, and it also earned the director a BAFTA nomination for Best Film. As we can see, by the time that he joined the production of Seconds, he had already established a reputation as a bold and innovative filmmaker, and I think it's fair to say that, the central performances aside, this is very much a director's movie, and a visionary one at that. From the very start, we are in the realms of experimental filmmaking, certainly for the time at least. Under the violins and organ of Jerry Goldsmith's discordant and atonal score, the viewer is confronted with extreme close-ups of distorted body parts, eyes multiply in front of us, lips part and twist into elongated shapes, and the camera disappears into an ear canal. The opening montage and the titles were designed and shot by Saul Bass, who famously designed the credits for many Hitchcock movies, including Psycho and North by Northwest. The morphing body parts and multiple eye images are something that we will see again in our second movie this week, The Substance, though in that case it is through the benefit of special effects makeup, as opposed to reflections filmed on a twisting sheet of mylar. This film, Frankenheimer appears to be telling us, is going to be about the body and about image and distortion, and it's going to make you, he warns, very, very uncomfortable. In an interview in 1969, Frankenheimer said, quote, In Seconds, the idea of distortion was terribly important. The distortion of what society had made this man, what the company then turned him out to be, and finally, when he was going to his death, everything had to be that complete distortion of reality, and the fact that it was all just utter nonsense. End quote. It is a deliberately disorientating opening, made all the more so when we immediately cut to Grand Central Station, and an initial sequence that feels more like a Cold War spy thriller than it does a portrait of a middle-aged banker commuting home, which is essentially what it actually is. Frankenheimer and his director of photography, James Wong Howe, used some quite groundbreaking photography here to create claustrophobia, tension, and anxiety, including the very early use, if not the first actual use, of cameras mounted on an actor's body. Dropped in the middle of the station, we do not know who anyone is, or why we seem to be pursuing somebody, or what is happening, or even why we feel so suddenly anxious. For the first 6 minutes of the film, all we have is claustrophobic black and white photography, and little to no dialogue, save to learn that our protagonist's name is Mr. Hamilton, and that he lives in Scarsdale. As we discussed in episode 14, by this time the US film industry was changing significantly, and the influence of European filmmakers and particularly the French New Wave was taking hold. And you can certainly see it in this movie. In fact, Seconds has been compared to a Twilight Zone episode directed by Jean-Luc Godard, which to be fair is pretty much on the nose. Cinematographer James Wong Howe, who first started out in the film industry back in 1917, was a genuine master of innovation behind the camera and earned the nickname Low-Key Howe for his extraordinary command of low-key lighting and deep shadows. But he was also pioneering wide-angle and deep focus techniques long before they became commonplace. He even created a roller skate handheld rig for boxing scenes in the 1947 movie Body and Soul, gliding around the ring to put the audience right in the middle of the fight. His talent didn't go unnoticed either. He was the first person of colour admitted to the American Society of Cinematographers in 1933, the first Asian cinematographer to be nominated for an Academy Award in 1938, and across his career he received 10 Oscar nominations, winning twice for The Rose Tattoo in 1955 and HUD in 1963. By the time he shot Seconds in 1966, he was still pushing the medium forward, and here uses incredibly bold wide-angle and fisheye distortions to amplify the mood of paranoia and alienation. Frankenheimer was incredibly excited to be working with him. The two were quickly in clear agreement that the story didn't lend itself to colour and should be filmed in black and white, and they also shared a love of depth of focus, something that is apparent throughout the film, where background and foreground in multiple scenes are so clear that one could almost be there in person. He also makes great use of tracking shots and low angles that emphasize space and give a dreamlike or drugged perspective, most notably, of course, during the very surreal dream sequence, which seems oddly reminiscent of Polanski's Repulsion. This was created by production designer Ted Howarth, who had been briefed to create something psychedelic, which he most certainly did. Some of his sets were deliberately distorted in perspective and then shot with standard lenses, while others were constructed in normal proportions but filmed with extreme wide-angle optics that warped their appearance. One of his key contributions was the company's maze-like offices, which gave Howe the chance to experiment with lens and camera movement, most memorably in the nightmarish climax as the reborn Tony Wilson is wheeled to his doom. Needless to say, none of this was easy filmmaking, particularly for the time, demanding multiple cameras, often handheld and sometimes placed in awkward, almost impossible positions. And this is all the more admirable given that the equipment used was a far cry from the sleek and lightweight cameras that we have today. Hamilton is played by John Randolph, an actor who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era, a period that we have spoken about now several times, particularly in episode 12. He and his wife, the actress Sarah Cunningham, were blacklisted from working in Hollywood and in New York film, television and radio in 1948, and in 1955 both were called before the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify regarding communist infiltration in the American entertainment industry. He and his wife refused to answer questions, citing the Fifth Amendment, something that was reported on in the newspapers under the headline, "6 Entertainers Defy Un-American Probers in Red Theatre Quiz." Randolph was actually one of the last blacklisted actors to regain employment in Hollywood films, and this was when Frankenheimer cast him for the role of Hamilton. This role would reignite his career, leading to roles across both film and television right up to his death in 2004. He appeared in both Escape from the Planet of the Apes and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes in the early 1970s, as well as the 1974 disaster movie Earthquake, the 1976 remake of King Kong, and many others. Fans of Seinfeld may also recognise him as the original actor to play George's father, Frank Costanza, before the role was taken over by Jerry Stiller. Hamilton is a man who is dissatisfied with his life and who has realised, now that it is just he and his wife at home, that everything he was told he needed to attain is empty and meaningless. He is the personification of the midlife crisis, as well as being the personification of the song Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads, mourning the life that he feels he should have had and wondering how on earth he ended up with this one. His job at the bank, punctuated by endless buzzing, may carry the promise of promotion, but it is as repetitive and predictable as his daily commute. Even the attempts by his wife to initiate intimacy are reduced to moments of squirm-inducing discomfort. It is hardly surprising that he then follows the instructions given to him by the voice of Charlie on the phone. And, as is pointed out to him by a character that we will talk about in a little more detail shortly, there was really never any doubt that he was going to. No matter how sceptical he may appear, and even though the company employs some deeply dubious tactics to secure his agreement, the fact that he went there in the first place suggests that he really doesn't need that much persuading. And the fact that he travels there in a meat wagon is unbelievably ironic given what happens across the rest of the movie. In this world, Hamilton is little more than livestock, even if he doesn't know it just quite yet. And this, of course, is only proven at the climax, when he is discussed quite simply as, quote, requisition from dayroom stock, end quote. To be fair to Hamilton, even if he had genuinely wanted to back out of the deal, it is doubtful that he could have stood up to the gentle and Machiavellian persuasiveness of the character played by Will Geer, who is billed only as the old man in the film's credits. And although he is nameless as the founder of the company, he may as well be Lucifer himself, or at least Mephistopheles, come to earth in his suit and bow tie to secure yet another Faustian deal. Geer was another actor who had been blacklisted in the 1950s and who was indeed a member of the Communist Party, though he is probably much better known as Grandpa Walton in the series of the same name. His performance here is scene-stealing, not least the malevolent look in his eye and the cold, fixed smile as he pushes Hamilton to commit, saying, "I have a message from Charlie. He told me to tell you that rebirth is painful. Isn't it easier, though, to go forward when you know you can't go back? But you knew that, didn't you? The minute you hung up on Charlie after that first call. The fact is, you really don't want to go back. Sakes, boy, you owe yourself this thing. Rebirth, life again, begin again, all new, all different. The way you always wanted it. You got another chance." And when Hamilton suggests that at least his wife or daughter will miss him, the old man simply responds, "What are you to her now? You excuse an old fool prying, son, but what does it all mean? It can't mean anything anymore. There's nothing anymore, is there? Anything at all." According to Frankenheimer's widow, this idea of escaping one's life and of starting over again was something that was very much in the air by the time the film was being made, when the love generation promised freedom and escape from the suburban dreams or nightmares of the 1950s. Hamilton doesn't understand where everything went wrong, but he does recognise that the things he was told were important, the job, the house, the marriage, really aren't. And that was an ethos that was very much the spirit of the decade. And this spirit is, of course, something we see in the bacchanalian wine-stomping scene which, to be honest and to my mind, goes on for far too long, but in which we see Tony finally experience a rebirth, if only for a few moments. Frankenheimer was, by all accounts, fascinated by the overall message of the novel, that you can never really escape from yourself, and this is certainly one of the overall points of the movie. Hamilton may have extensive surgery and be offered a new life as Tony Wilson, but he is doomed to make the same mistakes again and again and again, mainly because he doesn't understand what they are. When he returns to the company as Wilson at the end of the film, he explains to his former friend Charlie, quote, "I had to find out where I went wrong. The years I've spent trying to get all the things I was told were important, that I was supposed to want, things, not people or meaning, just things. And California was the same. They made the decisions for me all over again, and they were the same things, really. It's going to be different from now on. A new face and a name. I'll do the rest. I know it's going to be different." When Kirk Douglas was attached to the project, the original plan was for both Hamilton and his reborn second, Tony Wilson, to be played by him. And when Douglas pulled out from starring in the project, the next in line to be considered was Laurence Olivier, an actor who Frankenheimer believed was the only other person, apart from Douglas, who could pull off playing two roles. Frankenheimer travelled to the UK and met with Olivier, who was very interested in the role. However, the studio wanted a much bigger name star, and instead suggested Rock Hudson. Frankenheimer knew Hudson mainly as a light comedian, and wasn't immediately sure that the actor was right for the role, particularly playing two parts. However, this changed on meeting him. Hudson himself confessed that he didn't think he would be able to play both the older Hamilton and the younger Wilson, and suggested that Frankenheimer cast two actors instead, something which had not yet been considered, but which now seemed to make perfect sense. Rock Hudson was born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. in Illinois in 1925. After serving in the US Navy during the Second World War as an aircraft mechanic, Hudson moved to Hollywood with ambitions of becoming an actor, despite having little training or indeed any experience. Through sheer persistence, and no doubt through his good looks and presence, he caught the attention of Henry Wilson, a powerful agent in Hollywood who was known for shaping handsome young men into matinee idols. And it was he who changed Roy Scherer's name to Rock Hudson, which was deliberately chosen for its strong and rugged connotations. His earliest film work consisted of bit parts, but in 1954 his career transformed when he appeared in the movie Magnificent Obsession, directed by Douglas Sirk, the king of Technicolor melodrama. In this, he played a reckless playboy who is redeemed through love and sacrifice, not only proving himself as a leading man, but also establishing a lasting partnership with the director, when he would go on to star in All That Heaven Allows in 1955 and Written on the Wind in 1956. In 1955, Hudson also starred in Giant, opposite Elizabeth Taylor and James Dean, which earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, success continued, particularly due to his partnership with Doris Day and their appearance in a string of romantic comedies, which included Pillow Talk in 1959, Lover Come Back to Me in 1961, and Send Me No Flowers in 1964, all of which showcased his undoubtable charm and screen presence, as well as his comic timing, cementing an image as the typical romantic lead. And although he had appeared in films other than romantic comedies, Seconds was going to be a very different animal for him. In fact, he described the film as a, quote, very different type of picture, and certainly a different role for me. It's almost a horror movie. Certainly, it's a suspenseful movie, and very dramatic. End quote. He approached the role with no small amount of nervousness, describing it as a part where he would really be called upon to act, something that he felt he had never really done properly before. He was particularly nervous about the initial reveal beneath the bandages, worried that unless it was done in exactly the right way, people would find it funny. He worked very closely with Frankenheimer on the character, saying in an interview at the time, quote, "We arrive at the scene together, which makes me, as an actor, not only feel that I'm performing, but that I'm contributing, which is a marvellous feeling to have." End quote. And I think it's fair to say that his performance in Seconds is nothing short of revelatory, shifting from the dazed fragility of the rebirth scene, where he observes his new reflection with tears in his eyes, to the drunken bluster among the party guests, and then finally, of course, to the desperate terror of the climax. His portrayal of a man who is essentially an imposter in someone else's skin has real depth, and it remains a shame that he wasn't offered more opportunities like this, or the chance to work with directors willing to push him further and further out of his comfort zone. His discomfort at the wine festival is highly convincing, but to me, the standout moment is the depth to his listening when he visits his old life and learns that no one has really missed him, nor in fact did anyone really know him. His wife tells the man that she does not know is her husband that, quote, "He was a quiet man. I think the thing I most remember him for were his silences. It was as if he was always listening to something inside, some voice he never talked about, so I never knew what it was. He was a good man, but he lived as if he were a stranger here. I mean, he never let anything touch him. He was always absorbed in things, his job mostly. He worked hard. He became more detached, always had a look around his eyes, as if he were trying to say something. I don't know what. Protest against what he surrendered his life to. I never knew what he wanted." End quote. Despite what I and many retrospective viewers feel is an incredible performance, at the time Hudson's casting wasn't well received. His Hollywood image was too strong for many to take him seriously in the role, and audiences also struggled with the idea that the man who went into the operating room could realistically emerge as Rock Hudson. Frankenheimer himself later admitted that the casting caused, in his own words, quote, "a terrible time getting audiences to believe," end quote. Sadly, Hudson's performance, as incredible as it is, was ultimately derailed by the press and the public's refusal to see past the Hollywood image. So, as we seem to discover every week on this show, people really don't appreciate a good thing when it's right in front of them. Retrospective reviewers, though, have of course been far kinder, often calling this Hudson's greatest screen role and praising how he moves through a wide emotional range, from deep depression to pure elation and ultimately unfiltered horror. Tragically, though, Hudson's presence now brings an unintended symbolic weight to the film. He was, as we now know, gay at a time when exposure would have ended his career, and whilst it was an open secret in Hollywood, it was, for obvious reasons, never acknowledged publicly during his prime. Studios arranged relationships for publicity, and in 1955 he even briefly married Phyllis Gates, his agent's secretary, with the marriage ending after 3 years. And this off-screen life with hidden sexuality and the struggle of living with both a public and a private identity gives the movie a new and haunting resonance that has only deepened with time. In 1984, Rock Hudson was diagnosed with HIV, and by 1985 his condition had worsened. When he appeared at a press event with Doris Day, his emaciated appearance caused immediate speculation in the press, and in July that year, his publicist confirmed that he was suffering from AIDS. He was the first major Hollywood star to acknowledge the illness publicly. His announcement shocked the world. Until then, AIDS had been widely dismissed as affecting only marginalized groups, but Hudson's status as a Hollywood star forced the issue into mainstream awareness. The press, however, treated him with cruelty. Tabloid headlines sensationalized both his sexuality and his illness, focusing on his physical decline and suggesting betrayal in his lifelong concealment of his sexual orientation. Yet, alongside the intrusion, his bravery in confirming his diagnosis is now recognized as a significant moment in shifting the conversation about the disease. Hudson sought treatment in France, where friends attempted to secure access to an experimental therapy. Requests were made to the White House for assistance, but First Lady Nancy Reagan personally declined to intervene, despite Hudson's past friendship with her. This refusal later came to symbolise the Reagan administration's wider inaction during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. Rock Hudson died on October 2nd, 1985, at the age of 59. His death was front-page news worldwide, and he was mourned by colleagues and fans. His legacy as an actor endures through films that continue to be rediscovered and reassessed. And at the same time, his tragic role in the history of the AIDS crisis has also ensured his place in the broader story of both Hollywood and human history. Seconds was the American entry at the 1966 Cannes Film Festival, where it was poorly received and reportedly booed. Although James Wong Howe would receive an Academy Award nomination for his cinematography, after the film's national US release, where it was received quite poorly critically as well as commercially, the film disappeared from theatres within weeks. John Frankenheimer called the film a disaster, though he was, of course, happy to see the film re-evaluated and reappreciated in the following years. Rock Hudson, whose performance was once overlooked, later received praise and also awards from film societies and universities, and he frequently visited college cinema classes where he enjoyed discussing the film with students. Nevertheless, on more than one occasion, Frankenheimer referred to it as a movie that went from being a failure to a classic without ever being a success, which gives you an indication of how he felt about it. Fortunately, in the same year as Seconds, Frankenheimer also released the movie Grand Prix, which was a critical and financial success, and which became one of the 10 highest grossing films of the decade, nicely offsetting the financial failure of Seconds and securing his ability to continue working. In 1975, he directed The French Connection Part 2, and whilst William Friedkin is of course a tough act to follow, and the script was not as good, he acquitted himself admirably. A little less admirable was a film that he directed in 1979, which was called Prophecy, and this is an ecological horror movie involving mutant bear creatures born of pollution, and I have to say, it's pretty terrible. But even then, it is far better than his 1996 release, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which he famously took over from Richard Stanley, and which was a production so arduous that documentaries have been made about it. Frankenheimer's frustration with leading man Val Kilmer became legendary, and after Kilmer's final scene was completed, Frankenheimer is reported to have turned to the crew and said, quote, "Now get that bastard off my set." End quote. He continued to work in both film and TV movies into the 1990s, and on the big screen he returned to form with Ronin in 1998, starring Robert De Niro and Jean Reno. His final feature was released in 2000, and this was Reindeer Games, a crime thriller starring Ben Affleck. Sadly, John Frankenheimer died in Los Angeles, aged 72, in 2002, following complications after spinal surgery. His legacy remains that of a director who brought intelligence and visual daring to American cinema, and a collection of films that can safely be called classics. Seconds is, in my opinion, one of his best films, coming just after The Manchurian Candidate, not least for its experimental and genre-pushing cinematography and sweaty paranoid malevolence. At its centre are two fantastic performances from John Randolph and Rock Hudson, delivering the message of the film that no matter how much you alter your surroundings or how drastically you change your appearance, your flaws, your shortcomings, and even your nightmares will always travel with you. All of which brings us quite nicely to our second movie of the week, which is The Substance, released in 2024, starring Demi Moore, Margaret Qualley, and Dennis Quaid, and written and directed by Coralie Fargeat. Coralie Fargeat was born in Paris in 1976 and began making her own short films from the age of about 16 or 17. Although she wanted to attend film school, her academy of choice required 3 years of general academics as a prerequisite, and this led her to study politics at the Paris Institute of Political Studies. But after 3 years, she realised that she didn't really want to continue with academic education, and looking to gain direct experience, started working as a runner on film sets. She took her first trainee position in the year 2000 on a film called Passion of Mind, which interestingly enough starred Demi Moore, for whom she bought coffee every day as part of her running duties. This also, though, gave her the opportunity to watch filmmaking from behind the scenes, which, according to her, is how you really learn to make a movie. In 2003, she directed a short film called Le Télégramme about two women in wartime France anxiously awaiting the postman, fearing that he will be bringing them bad news about their loved ones. This 12-minute short, which is currently available to watch on YouTube, demonstrates both her eye for composition and her knack for a streamlined narrative, and it also quickly attracted attention on the festival circuit, winning several awards. Following this success, she temporarily moved to French television, and between 2007 and 2008 co-created and directed a comedy miniseries called Les Fées Cloches, or The Bell Fairies. In 2010, she decided to return to education and attended a year-long screenwriting workshop at the prestigious French film school L'Fémis, which was also the academic home of Julia Ducournau, who we discussed back in episode 10. Even then, Fargeat's love of genre cinemas was raising eyebrows. Her first project there was about a woman who believed she was being pursued and attacked by insects, and who eventually descends into madness. And this idea was far from what was typically developed at the school, and she remembers everyone looking at her like she was, quote-unquote, an alien. This general resistance to genre cinema led her and 6 other filmmakers to create a collective called La Squadra, or the Team, helping each other make their own shorts. As well as supporting each other's productions, they gathered once every month and invited producers, directors, and film distributors into their tiny living rooms, learning how the French film industry worked over slices of pizza. Then, in 2014, she released her short film Reality Plus, a science fiction story about a world obsessed with beauty and self-image, and a technology that can change one's external appearance. A visually and thematically striking film, it earned selections at international festivals, including Tribeca, and is, at the time of recording, also available to watch on YouTube. As you can probably tell from that very brief synopsis, it contains many seeds of ideas that would come to fruition with the substance, most notably the strong visual design and depictions of technology, isolation, and an image-obsessed culture gone wrong. Her real breakthrough, though, came with her debut feature Revenge in 2017, which premiered at the Midnight Madness section of the Toronto International Film Festival, where it gained immediate attention for its bold and uncompromising vision and striking visual storytelling. A very successful entry in an often problematic subgenre, the film tells the story of a young woman called Jen, played by Matilda Lutz, who is raped and left for dead in the desert by 3 men, and the revenge that she then subsequently takes on her attackers. Like her early shorts, Fargeat faced significant resistance to the subject matter in France when making the movie, and has described the filmmaking process as a constant struggle because it was just not the type of film that was typically made in the country. Filmed in a mixture of both French and English, in this movie Fargeat pulls out all of the stops thematically, visually, and through sound and editing, saying that she pushed everything in the movie to the extreme because she wanted her message to be loud and clear. And that it most certainly is. Revenge is a film that is a deliberately uncomfortable watch, saturated in both colour and in violence, and anchored around intense performances from all of its cast, but most notably Matilda Lutz. When discussing her approach to the film, Fargeat said that she wanted to create a character that could be as superficial, seductive, and as sexy as she wanted to be, and that never being an excuse for anyone to harm her. She continued, quote, "From the beginning to the end, the character stays with her body. She is who she is, and she can be strong, even if she's still wearing a bikini and is covered in blood." End quote. The result was a film that critics hailed as a visceral and political reworking of familiar tropes through a feminist lens, and it also marked Fargeat as a figure to watch among genre fans, particularly after it arrived for streaming on Shudder, which is where you can currently watch it if you're in the UK. In addition to her film work, she has also contributed to international television. In 2022, she directed episode 9 of the Netflix series The Sandman, titled Collectors, and this further expanded her presence in English language projects and also demonstrated her ability to work within large-scale international productions while maintaining her own visual style, all of which, of course, helped enormously when it came to the substance. And now we are getting into spoilers, so if you haven't seen The Substance yet, now is the time to hit pause. The Substance tells the story of Elizabeth Sparkle. She is a former movie star with her very own spot on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and who has a successful career on TV with her Jane Fonda-esque daily fitness show. However, on her 50th birthday, she is unceremoniously fired by her boss, Harvey, who tells her that renewal is inevitable and that at the age of 50, everything stops. Harvey, who is played to glorious success by Dennis Quaid, is clearly well over 50 himself, and with stained teeth and a gluttony for shrimp, is also quite physically repellent, which only underlies the fact that Elizabeth exists very much in a man's world. Harvey was originally to be played by the late Ray Liotta, who sadly passed away in 2022, shortly before the film went into production. Whilst it would have been fascinating to see him in the role, and one certainly can imagine it quite easily, there is no doubt of the level of commitment that Quaid brings to the part, not least in his desire to make the shrimp eating scene as repellent as possible, eating about 2 kilos over the course of filming the sequence. And it's probably worth pointing out here that firstly, it's clearly no accident that the character is called Harvey, and secondly, he is just one in a parade of truly obnoxious men that populate the film, from Sue's bike-riding lover to the giggling cohort of studio executives. The male gender really, and unsurprisingly, doesn't come across particularly well. As we can see from her 2014 short Reality Plus, the director had been contemplating the themes of The Substance for a long time, saying that the film was inspired by what she had felt her whole life and how she had lived within her body, saying, quote, "I had been led to constantly judge it in a negative way. I had been led to torture it in many ways, to try to make it look perfect within the beauty standards that were presented to me as being the only valuable option." End quote. She went on to say that this took an even greater resonance when she reached her 40s and started moving towards her 50s, when she started to have what she calls violent thoughts about aging. And these thoughts were so violent and so self-destructive that she decided it was the right time for her to do something about it. And whilst the obvious thematic touchstone for this movie is indeed her 2014 sci-fi short, there is also a very clear through line to this movie from Revenge, as the first is about a woman suffering external violence at the hands of men, and the second is about a woman suffering internalized violence as she tries to adhere to unrealistic beauty standards that are set by a male-dominated society. For the director, they are both sides of the same coin, saying that whilst external violence is more obvious and visible, the insidious internalized violence generated by society and its values can be equally as destructive. From the outset, she knew that the film would be bold and provocative, and she chose to write the script on spec, beginning with what can only be described as the birth of Sue, though at the time the characters had no names, or indeed anything else. Fargeat has described this scene as essentially containing all of the core DNA of the movie. It is an incredibly visceral moment with no words, and as she puts it, quote, "A madness that goes more and more, and that gives frames that are crazier and crazier, and of course all of the flesh that I'm going to film in very macro shots." End quote. By this point in the movie, Elizabeth has resorted to a new experimental drug, the substance of the title, which has been marketed to her as promising a, quote, "better version of yourself, younger, more beautiful, and more perfect," end quote. This unlocks her DNA and allows for a new and improved version to emerge, in this case directly from her back, in a scene which caused quite a few shock gasps when I saw it both times at the cinema. As in seconds, it would appear that rebirth is indeed painful, and this renewed version is Sue, so named because the director wanted to evoke baby doll or Lolita imagery. The deal is that both will have 7 days on and 7 days off, but Sue starts to like her new life a little bit too much, with rather nasty consequences. She is played by Margaret Qualley, who said that the film was very much out of her comfort zone, but that she gravitated towards the script because it spoke about topics present in everybody's lives. And having grown up as a dancer and then as a model before moving into acting, she herself had felt an incredible amount of pressure on the idea of being physically perfect, particularly within the dance world. She was also fascinated by the character, describing Sue as the least beautiful character she had ever played because she is basically heartless. Her preparation for the role was extremely physical, with much focus on how she would move, saying that as Sue entered the world as a fully formed human without having had any experiences at all, she wouldn't move in the same way as you or I. And she gives an incredibly good performance, going from hopeful ingenue when she first emerges to incredibly desperate, fame-hungry starlet by the climax. And whilst the role is an extremely physical one that required prosthetic breasts to be applied every day, it also allows her to display a fine comedic timing. Rather bizarrely, given its blatant narrative and themes, Fargeat only realised that her debut feature Revenge was a feminist movie after it had been released. With this script, she said she wanted to consciously write a movie that addressed what she was feeling in terms of inequality. The screenplay took 2 years to write, and whilst not her native language, was written in English, as she felt this would help her reach as many people as possible with her message. She has consistently described the film as both horror and satire, saying that she wanted to embrace the humour that arises when horror escalates beyond reason, and that combining laughter with shock was essential to how she wanted the audience to experience the story. The finished screenplay went into an incredible level of detail, stating in very precise terms everything that she planned to film so that anyone who came on board would understand exactly what she intended to make. And this level of detail is also incredibly important because the substance is an incredibly visual film. Of the 146 pages of the original screenplay, only 29 are devoted to dialogue. The visual elements of the film, and also some narrative ones, are of course not without their cinematic reference points, and Fargeat is incredibly honest about her inspirations and homages, listing Cronenberg's The Fly, Kubrick's The Shining, De Palma's Carrie, and the films of John Carpenter as key references. And it makes absolute sense that this film would wear these references on its hyper-stylized sleeve. The world of this movie is not meant to be the real world. It is instead a strange, cartoonish hyper-reality with day-glow colours, pop-art hallways, and TV programmes that are just advertised as new show or New Year's Eve show, creating an imagined Los Angeles in a heightened and stylised world. A significant criticism of the film has been that it lacks substance, but that really is the point. The whole world of the movie is without substance and meaning. There is no nuance here, no subtlety, no empathy, and no warmth. This is the world that the film is portraying, and in stripping away those qualities, it leaves us with an exaggerated mirror of modern culture, glossy, hollow, and very sadly, becoming more and more familiar by the day. Much like Seconds, the film is shot with a deliberately disorientating lens, courtesy of DP Benjamin Krakoun, using helmet and body cameras, handhelds, crane shots, fisheyes, and extreme close-ups. It comes as no surprise to hear Fargeat say that she is far less interested in realism and violence, but in transcending it and creating something that almost becomes like pop art. As the writing progressed, it became clear that the substance was a film that defied categorization, a genre piece that was also funny, heavily stylized, and deeply unconventional. Based on prior experiences, the director realized that in France, such an approach would inevitably encounter restrictions and limitations. Fortunately, though, the success of Revenge had brought her to the attention of Hollywood, and for a brief moment she was in the frame to direct the Black Widow movie for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although that didn't come to fruition, the moment felt right for her to begin collaborating with American partners. She was clear, however, that she did not want to fall into the trap of other French directors who had gone to the US to make projects they hadn't written and who had subsequently lost creative control. Through her Paris-based company Blacksmith, Fargeat partnered with working title co-chairs Eric Fellner and Tim Bevan, seeing them as a strong bridge between the US and Europe. Universal Studios then became attached, but very importantly, her contract stipulated that she had the final say on the cut of the film. This allowed her to shape the shoot to the specific needs of the film and to also grant herself maximum creative freedom, something that would become incredibly important as the production continued. The key to the movie, though, was finding the right person to play Elizabeth Sparkle. Fargeat wanted an actress who would be iconic, who would symbolise what the movie is about, though she also knew that it would basically mean confronting an actress with her own worst fears. There were several flat-out rejections, and then one day Demi Moore's name was mentioned. Although Fargeat almost dismissed it outright, she sent the script anyway, telling herself that there was nothing to lose. And then came the surprise. Demi Moore was interested. Fargeat has described Moore as having an iconic resonance, saying that if you look at her past work and her life, you can see that Demi Moore has been dealing with the themes of the substance her entire career. Demi Moore was born in Roswell, New Mexico in 1962. Her parents separated before she was born, and she grew up in a fractured home environment with a stepfather whose gambling and alcoholism created further issues. Moving frequently, she left school in her mid-teens and began working as a model, which eventually led to acting, and she first gained visibility on General Hospital on TV in the early 1980s, which gave her a grounding in performance and also a route into film. Her first leading film role came with Parasite in 1982, directed by king of the low-budget horror Charles Band. This was a dystopian science fiction horror shot in 3D and tells the story of a scientist who creates a genetically engineered parasite that escapes and begins to attack people. It was very much a staple of video stores in the mid-1980s, though it's not one that I ever got around to renting, but I do clearly remember the cover. By the mid-80s, she had moved into more mainstream films that, for better or for worse, established her as part of the so-called Brat Pack. A pejorative term that was coined in 1985 by journalist David Blum in a New York Magazine article, the phrase was a deliberate play on the Rat Pack of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., grouping together actors including Tom Cruise, Emilio Estevez, Rob Lowe, Matt Dillon, Andrew McCarthy and others, describing them as, quote, a roving band of famous young stars on the prowl for parties, women and a good time. End quote. The name quickly stuck, and although it was never an organised group, the Brat Pack became shorthand for a generation of actors who defined 1980s young adult cinema, which of course included Demi Moore. She starred in St. Elmo's Fire in 1985 and About Last Night in 1986, both opposite Rob Lowe. Perhaps not surprisingly, most of the actors viewed the label as a curse and felt it undermined their credibility, becoming a shadow that they spent much of their careers trying to escape. But as the decades passed, the perspective started to shift, with some of the group recognising that the term marked a cultural movement when their films captured the hopes, fears and energy of Generation X. Moore has spoken quite candidly about this change in perspective, telling Entertainment Weekly in 2020, quote, "It was a label that was used in a negative way, but ultimately it represents a time in our lives where we were all experiencing this thing together, and I'm grateful for that." End quote. But it was in 1990 that her career really took off with the release of Ghost, a supernatural romance turned global phenomena featuring a stylish hairdo, Patrick Swayze and a pottery wheel. It established her as one of the most bankable actresses of the decade, and she consolidated this position with performances in A Few Good Men in 1992, opposite Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson, Indecent Proposal in 1993 with Robert Redford and Woody Harrelson, and Disclosure in 1994 opposite Michael Douglas. I have to admit, many of these films passed me by, and I have in fact never seen Ghost or Indecent Proposal, but a film of Moore's that I did enjoy is The Seventh Sign, released in 1988 just before her career went supersonic. Also starring Michael Biehn and Jürgen Prochnow, the film is a biblical apocalypse story in which she plays a pregnant woman whose unborn baby may be linked to the end of the world. I haven't seen it in years, so I can't say how it's held up, but I did very much enjoy it at the time. In August 1991, though, Moore attracted a great deal of controversy, which seems a little ridiculous now in hindsight, not for a film appearance, but for a Vanity Fair cover story, for which she was photographed nude and heavily pregnant by Annie Leibovitz. This groundbreaking image was considered by some to be shocking, even indecent, and several outlets refused to stock the issue, but it did change how pregnancy was presented in the media. Moore herself described the cover as an act of ownership over her body and her image, and it remains one of the most famous magazine covers of the 20th century. Even more controversy would follow a few years later, this time concerning her at the time record-breaking salary of $12.5 million for the movie Striptease in 1996. The press branded her, quote-unquote, Gimme More, a name that was endlessly repeated as an accusation of greed and excess. She has subsequently said in interviews that the label was deeply hurtful and damaging to her career and her reputation, and the contrast with her male contemporaries is a stark one. Her then-husband, Bruce Willis, was commanding even higher salaries at the time, but his earnings were framed as proof of his star power. The commercial failure of Striptease, though, only intensified the narrative, and reports of diva-like behaviour during the filming of G.I. Jane in 1997, which may have been exaggerated or even invented, reinforced a caricature of a demanding and overpaid star. Personally, I think it's fair to say that the media deliberately went out of their way to besmirch her reputation, and her work was often eclipsed by coverage of her personal life, including her divorce from Willis in the year 2000. Against this backdrop, she staged what was described as a comeback in 2003, though in reality she hadn't really been anywhere, with Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, in which she played Angel Gone Bad Madison Lee. Much of the press at the time focused on her appearance, particularly her physique at 40, with many accusations of secret cosmetic surgeries. Her age and appearance was commented on again and again when she married Ashton Kutcher in 2005, with the media positively frothing at the mouth over the difference in their ages, something that would be brought up yet again when they divorced in 2015. She continued to work in film and television, including the movie Half-Light in 2006, a fairly lightweight but still entertaining thriller-cum-ghost story, in which she plays a novelist, grieving her child's accidental death. She had a recurring role on the TV show Empire in 2018, and also gave a very against-type performance in the short-lived series Brave New World in 2020. As you can tell from that admittedly rather potted biography, Moore had indeed been dealing with the themes of the substance all of her career, not least in 2021, when, after walking in a runway show for Fendi, she was accused of having had yet more surgery. In the same year, the Daily Telegraph ran a feature titled 3 Decades of Demi Moore, and what her down-aging can teach us. Charming. Reading the screenplay for The Substance, Moore said that she was equally moved and blown away, saying, quote, "It definitely took some time to process and digest. I think the film is about the fear of what other people think, of not measuring up, that compare and despair. That idea really moved me and made me want to step in and explore the depths of that heartache." End quote. She went on to say that what really struck her about the screenplay was the depiction of harsh violence that we inflict upon ourselves, saying that it's not what's being done to you, it's what we do to ourselves that is the problem. Nevertheless, it was not an immediate decision. She also thought to herself that she didn't know whether the film would be a triumph or a disaster, and while she certainly found that interesting, and was also something she had experienced when she read the screenplay for Ghost, she certainly needed to spend quite a lot of time talking to the director about her vision. Fargeat explained that she really wanted Moore to understand the type of movie she was going to make and how far she wanted to go. It was particularly important that the actress understood the levels of intensity and the levels of prosthetics and nudity, as well as the visuals and the sound. Ultimately, the director wanted to ensure that Moore really wanted to join the admittedly small crew in France and start telling the story. For her part, Moore watched Revenge so she could get to understand the director's sensibility, which of course was also incredibly clearly laid out in the screenplay. Nevertheless, no amount of preparation, reading or discussion could match up to the reality of filming, with as many as 7 hours in the makeup chair, leaving only an hour or two for filming itself. And this commitment shows through in every frame that she appears on screen. It is a largely silent performance where everything is conveyed through expression, gesture and posture, which is no small feat considering that for much of the film she is also alone and therefore has no one to react to or work against. It is, in my opinion, a performance that encompasses pretty much every emotion and shows the full range of her talents in ways that many of her earlier movies have perhaps failed to do. Her transformation across the film is not just one of prosthetics, it is one of performance, and the fact that she didn't win the Oscar is still rather surprising, almost a year later. Fargeat has described the actress as extremely instinctive and a risk-taker, somebody who had a very rock and roll sensibility in terms of the things that she wanted to do at that stage in her life. Nevertheless, even though everything was spelled out in the script, Moore later admitted that, quote, "It definitely read a lot easier on the page than it did in the physical. I'm very grateful that I have an ability to get very zen and very still." End quote. The principal photography for The Substance began in August 2022 and took place mostly in France, which allowed the director to get far more from the budget, particularly in terms of time. The shoot was an unusually long one because so much of the film's transformation work was done with practical effects, and this meant incredibly long makeup sessions, careful planning, and endless resets. In addition, the multiple camera effects and techniques used required multiple takes that could be stitched together in editing, and this was compounded by Fargeat's perfectionist eye for detail that also required multiple takes of the same scene. Despite the scale of the ambition, she kept the production lean, treating it more like an indie film than a studio movie, giving her greater control, and also meaning that the actors could stay at the centre of the process rather than being lost in the machinery. This approach was far from easy, but for the director, the immediacy of seeing something real and physical on the screen was worth the effort. The film, after all, is, in her words, about flesh and bone, and about women's bodies, and so to use excessive CGI instead of in-camera practical work would have betrayed the actual point of the movie. And the discipline and hard work certainly pay off. The effects, the multiple takes, the cinematography all give the film its incredibly distinctive texture, not to mention its outrageous climax. And while the visuals are quite staggering, they are made all the more effective by the soundtrack and sound design, with sucking, organic and bubbling soundscapes accompanying the transformations, which effectively place the listener inside the character's body as they change. The composer Rafferty divided the score into two sound worlds, organic and nostalgic for Elizabeth, synthetic and processed for Sue, with the music escalating into chaos in the climax, and this duality is something that was also demonstrated through the lighting and cinematography, with two incredibly different states created for each character. The climax is, of course, outrageous, and in this we are introduced to the Monstro Elisa Sue. This was the creation of an effects team led by special makeup designer Pierre-Olivier Prassin, who created prosthetic builds for successive mutations, designed the back-splitting birth sequence, puppets for invasive shots, and also sprayed literal gallons of blood. Reports on the actual amount of blood used vary, but all confirm that tens of thousands of gallons were deployed for the film's climax. And these scenes are quite possibly the most divisive of the movie, with more than one viewer commenting that the climax ruined the film for them, going to such an excess that it slipped into the ridiculous. And I can understand why people think that. It is basically a blood-drenched spectacular, filmed somewhat like a Busby Berkeley musical number, and to be honest, on my first viewing, I really didn't know what to make of it. For one thing, I wasn't expecting it to be so laugh-out-loud funny. But I have to say, on second watch, I now really appreciate it and think it the perfect ending to the film. And I would agree with Fargeat's own words that the humour and extremity allow the violence and the social political issues to go through to the audience in a much more bearable way. A group of people, though, for whom the ending didn't go down well, and for whom it wasn't bearable, were the executives from Paramount Pictures, who had been due to distribute the movie. The road to the initial studio screening had been a long and difficult one, a period which Fargeat describes as her Apocalypse Now. Her attention to detail and need for extensive takes was challenging for the cast and crew, and there were, by all accounts, various conflicts on set. This was then followed by an incredibly arduous editing process. But as the film finished post-production, Universal became increasingly worried about how audiences would respond. According to some reports, an executive hated the film so much that he insisted on an extensive recut, including the quote-unquote disgusting ending. Fargeat refused, and because her contract gave her the final cut, she was able to stand firm. Shortly before its planned world premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, Universal pulled out of distributing the film, selling the rights worldwide to Mubi, something that the director has described as deeply stressful but also deeply necessary. It was ultimately her refusal to change the ending that led to Universal stepping away. And I can't help but wonder how those executives felt when they heard that the film had won the Best Screenplay at that very Cannes Film Festival. Following the success at the film festival, the film's release through Mubi reached international cinemas and eventually streaming audiences. It became the platform's highest-grossing theatrical release, and awards recognition quickly followed, including a Golden Globe Award for Demi Moore and Academy Award nominations in several categories. The film's combination of extreme imagery, feminist commentary, and high-profile performances made it one of the most discussed horror releases of 2024, and it continues to shock and impress today. The aggression that Sue and Elizabeth feel and display to each other is the ultimate in self-hatred, but it is also the hatred of generations, the older loathing the younger for her freedoms and success, and the younger hating the older for supposedly holding her back, not realizing that she is her reason for existing. As both the director and the star have expressed, the film is about the uncontrollable violence that we inflict on ourselves in order to conform, as well as the impossible beauty standards against which we measure a person's value. But it's also a story about loneliness and isolation. Part of the tragedy of Elizabeth Sparkle is not just in what she does to herself, but in the fact that she is also completely alone in the world. There are no friends, no family, no one to check in on her, and one wonders if these are things she sacrificed in her pursuit of stardom. In any case, despite her spacious apartment and supposed success, when push comes to shove, all that she has is herself and her memories of fame. One of the criticisms that I've heard more than once about the movie is not understanding why Elizabeth would take the substance in the first place, given that she didn't really know what it would do, or indeed, why she continues once she does. I think the very sad answer to that question is because she literally has nothing left to lose. Seconds and the substance are, of course, both linked by their theme of rebirth and renewal gone wrong, with their protagonists trying and failing to either rework their past or reshape their future. Both films use the conceit of different actors playing different aspects of the same person, underlining the fractured nature of identity, and both feature boundary-pushing and surprising performances from their leads, two actors that come with no small amount of Hollywood history attached. And despite one being in black and white and the other in garish and plastic hypercolour, both share experimental camera work and also, quite clearly, a love for a long corridor. But where the pressure in Seconds is that of the mid-century middle-class fantasy, career, family, and suburban respectability, the substance explores the brutality of contemporary female experience, where value is measured in youth and beauty. Hamilton/Wilson realises far too late that the life he was told to want was never worth the effort, leaving him hollow and directionless. Elizabeth Sparkle, on the other hand, probably knows that her world is shallow from the outset, but destroys herself in a frantic attempt to preserve it. One film is deeply male in its anxieties, and the other is unapologetically feminist. And yet both, at their core, grapple with identity, social pressure, and the sinister allure of mysterious organisations that promise reinvention and renewal. As long as you're willing to pay the price. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode. So it just leaves me to say thank you for listening, and I hope that you have enjoyed the show. If you have, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any thoughts on any of the films we've discussed so far in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordoublebill@gmail.com, and you can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordoublebill. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there'll be no episode next weekend, but we will be back on the 12th of October with a couple of shapeshifters. So, first up when we return is Cat People from 1943, produced by Val Lewson, directed by Jacques Tourneur, and starring Simone Simon, Kent Smith, and Jane Randolph. And then we follow that with The Company of Wolves from 1984, from director Neil Jordan, and starring Angela Lansbury, David Warner, and Sarah Patterson. So if you want to watch along, you have 2 weeks to do so. And if you're in the UK, Cat People is currently available to watch for free on the BBC iPlayer, as well as being available to rent from most streaming services. And The Company of Wolves is available to watch for free, albeit with ads, on ITVX, as well as for rental from Apple TV, Amazon, or via the BFI player. So I'll be back on the 12th of October for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a really great fortnight. Goodbye.